will play a big role in it. And the cotton gin especially will have such a huge impact on the production of cotton and, and when it gets to America, America is going to industrialize, so it's going to be a major cause. Oh, that's great. Okay, I'm really glad you guys can hear me. So, if you guys missed the beginning, the replay will be available for free, so you guys can always go look at that. And so the power loom, speeds up textile weaving. You don't need the cottage system anymore. The spinning jenny weaves stuff. It weaves textiles faster inside factories, and it was really convenient for women and children to use. The steam engine is going to be the main power source of the first industrial revolution, and you're going to see it power railroads, factories, everything. And the cotton gin cotton is what textiles of the time were primarily made out of. So with the cotton gin, it's going to revolutionize cotton picking and make the textile industry boom. And like I said, the textiles are going to be the industry that carries the first industrial revolution. But in the second industrial revolution, we have all these really huge inventions that we mostly use today, that we actually all use all of them today. So for cars, we have Henry Ford to thank. You guys have heard of Fords, right? So that's his company, and he created the automobile, and that's going to create this huge new industry. And then we have the light bulb, which is made by Thomas Edison, of course, and he's basically going to revolutionize working hours and like how long people can stay up, because instead of relying on daylight, they can rely on candles. They can rely on electricity instead. And electricity and chemistry are going to be the main industries in this time period in the second industrial revolution. And the Bessemer process, which is created by Henry Bessemer, it improves iron. So, like I said before, in the first industrial revolution, England basically relied on coal and iron and wood and water, like in the steam engine. But with the invention of steel, which basically fuses iron with another better metal it became the better building material, and steel slowly replaced iron on railroads and other important matters, like transportation-wise, or building buildings, basically. And then the telephone, like the phone, is created by Alexander Graham Bell, and he revolutionizes communication, and it's just really convenient for people. And yeah. So one more important thing is going to be the combustion engine, which is going to be the improvement on the steam engine because it uses petroleum instead of water. So how do we get from the first industrial revolution that started in Britain to industry spreading all around the world? And if you think it's because England was so very kind to share their secrets, you would be so wrong. So England likes all the money that they're getting, and they like because they're industrialized, they can make more for less. They can make more product for less money, less hours, less labor, all of that, pay lower wages. And they're the only country that's industrialized. So because they're the only country that's industrialized, they basically have a monopoly on a bunch of markets, and they're spreading, and everyone is forced to buy from them. And all of this great economic progress, great economic and technological innovation, England wants to show that off. So they have this technological exhibition at the Crystal Palace. And this event is known as the Great Exhibition of 1851, and it's going to be the first world fair out of like a series of world fairs. And these world fairs are just going to be ways for countries to show off what they've created, basically. And this, it inspires other countries to industrialize. After only 10 years, England is like so on top of like economically and technologically that all the other countries want to follow. But like I said, England's not going to let their England's not going to let their industry secrets get out, and the only way to do that is to block inventors from sneaking out of the country. So they're going to not allow inventors to immigrate, but because of this, inventors are going to be like in competition with other inventors for government support, because the government would subsidize, and subsidize means to pay for or support with money. So they would subsidize inventors to make more inventions. So if you're competing with other inventors, it's inconvenient for you in an industrialized country. But if other countries aren't industrialized and they want to be, but they don't know how to, then they're going to pay higher prices for you to basically go to their country. So inventors would have to sneak out of England and go to other countries. And we're going to see them sneak out to places like Germany, which is going to be really important, and America and France. So like I said, England's really greedy, and they keep their inventors from leaving. And some inventors are forced to sneak out with blueprints that they remember in their brains. And these inventors that snuck out with their blueprints, like remembered inside their heads, one such person, known as Samuel Slater, he's going to sneak out he was an apprentice at a British factory, and he's going to sneak out to America. He's going to, go there, not bring his blueprints with him because he remembers them in his head. And he's going to go to America and create the first industrial mill, and basically he's known as the father of the American Industrial Revolution. So this event, by the way, like sneaking out, is going to happen in Germany, which is going to be really important. And I'll tell you guys why in a bit. And France, who's England's #1 competitor at this point. If you guys remember, not 30 years of war, but like 100 years war and all that stuff. American Revolution, rivals. So the picture is basically the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition of 1851. So if you guys remember the picture I showed you earlier, in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, it was mostly Western Europe that was industrializing and not Eastern Europe. And I'm going to get into why that is. So on the left, we have Western Europe, and on the right, we have Eastern Europe. So Western Europe is actively trying to be industrialized. England is the king, and every Western country wants to follow that. And Western Europe industrialized because they have really good geography. They're closer to America, which is like one of the big trading partners. Now they have their good geography allows them to be on top of a lot of natural resources, like England and Germany, which is a relatively new country at this point. Germany has so many natural resources. And Western Europe saw a lot of government support. Like I said earlier, their inventors were subsidized, so they were always trying to improve stuff, improve like factories, improve productivity, and if you improve things, you get paid. So, money. And Western Europe just had way more money than Eastern Europe in general. And in this society, power is held by the factory owners. In all societies, power is held by those with money, like a lot of money. But industrialization caused power to be held by factory owners. Also, they had gone through an agricultural revolution, which I didn't include on here, but that's important to note that once England goes through an agricultural revolution, every other country near them is going to go through one as well. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, which is like Russia, those countries on that side, they're not industrialized. They're very agricultural, very traditional and rural, which we saw with Peter the Great and stuff. They have really bad geography. If you guys know anything about Russia, it's so cold over there. you can like barely farm anything on that land. And there's a serious lack of government support because of serfdom and power being held by landowners. So serfdom is basically slavery, but with a nicer name. Actually, I don't know if serfdom's nicer, but it's practically slavery. Except instead of being tied to a person, these peasants are tied to the land that they work on, and they have to basically work their way out of slavery. So maybe it's a step higher because you can work your way out, but it's basically indentured servitude. So because power is held by the landowners, land is so important, and people didn't want to give that up to build factories because they didn't see the point in it. So Eastern Europe is going to stay unindustrialized for a long, long time. And we're only going to start seeing industrialization in countries like Russia when people like Lenin come into power. Got that? Do you guys have any questions before I go on? Now that we've gone through basically the first industrial revolution. All right, if there are no questions, or if you guys have questions, make sure to use the ask a question button. So now make sure that you guys remember that when I say Europe industrialized, Western Europe industrialized, Eastern Europe has a long, long way to go. So here's a really quick chart of the first industrial revolution versus the second industrial revolution. And production-wise, they went from handmade goods to machinery, or cottage system to factories. And some people that opposed the rise of machines in England were called Luddites. So Luddites, Luddites. And these Luddites were, farmers and cottage workers, and they hated industrialization. It's taking their jobs, their means of life. So they would break machines. They would very violently break machines, but people can make machines faster than they can break them. So their movement never went anywhere. But it's important to note that there was opposition to this industrialization. And the first industrialization, the finished goods were primarily textiles. And textiles are the industry that's going to carry the first industrial revolution. You're going to see clothes produced faster, shoes, all that good stuff. It's going to be way faster. We don't need a cottage system anymore. We're going to sell it for cheaper, but we're going to sell more of it, so we're going to make more money. And textiles made by machines were basically the same quality as those that were handmade, but because handmade items take so much effort, they cost more money. So obviously, if you're the consumer, you're going to buy more machine-made items than handmade items if they're the same quality. And the engine that's going to basically spur all of the first industrial revolution is the steam engine. So, boats, railroads, that good stuff, all powered by steam. And power sources during this time are water, coal, wood, and iron is not really one, but it's a really important building material. But with the migration of people from the countryside into the city, the cities were awful, awful places to live. They're dirty, disease-ridden, pollution. There's a lot of pollution and very overcrowded. You'll have these very compact apartments, sometimes paid for by the factory that you work at, but where it should be one family per room, you're going to sometimes see 3 families per room. And this overcrowding was like everywhere. And because of this overcrowding, if one person gets sick, everyone else is going to get sick. Because were they very healthy back then, and did they know much about medicine? No, they didn't. So one person gets sick, everyone gets sick. And because cities, these apartment buildings are in cities because the factories are in cities. So they have it really close. So factories and these apartments are really close. And if you guys remember the picture I showed you earlier, all that smoke, all that yummy pollution was falling all over the city. Any waste would go into rivers that had drinking water for the people. So, pollution goes into drinking water. People get sick. Everyone gets sick. The city's overcrowded. It's infested with rats and like fleas. And and there's like human waste everywhere. Basically, just you don't want to live in the cities. And later in the stream, we're going to see what rich people did to not live with these poor people. So in the second industrial revolution, we went from machinery and textiles to better machinery in other places like electricity, chemistry, all that stuff. And finished goods during this time are going to vary widely. We're going to have automobiles, like synthetic dyes. Like purple was not a color before the second industrial revolution. Fuchsia was not a color. You have chemistry to thank for that. Telephones, light bulbs, electricity, those are going to be the major industries of this time. Oh, and leisurely activities, movies, radio, advertisements. Modern day life basically got started in the second industrial revolution. And the engine that's going to power all this is the internal combustion engine. And like I said earlier, it used petroleum, which is basically oil. And internal combustion engines were used in cars and like the prototypes for airplanes and ships. It's going to be way more efficient than the steam engine and give way more power. Speaking of power sources, the second industrial revolution relied on petroleum and electricity. Surprising, I know. But with the rise of these industries, they became, the people became dependent on these for life. You don't need candles anymore, so kerosene was out the window. So they converted raw oil into petroleum instead of kerosene. And learning to harness electricity radically changed everyone's lives. And in the city, it's better, but I still wouldn't want to live there, and I'm pretty sure you guys wouldn't either. And the reason why it's better, a little bit better, is because after, how long has it been? After something like 80 something years, people finally realized that maybe we do need to clean our cities, after 80 years. So they started with sanitation and they started rebuilding cities to be more open and maybe like have a park for that breath of fresh air. So do you guys have any questions about the differences between the first and second industrial revolution? Okay, so if there are no questions, we're going to keep going. And now I'm going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution affected the roles of men and women in society. So women are still considered caretakers, where they're going to rear children, educate them as best as they can, and take care of the house, make food, wash the dishes, all that good stuff. And during this time, we're going to see the rise of an attitude towards women, I suppose, or this view towards women, known as the cult of domesticity. And it's not actually a cult, guys, okay? Make sure you don't actually think they're a cult of women who love being caretakers. Cult is short for culture. So the cult of domesticity is this prevailing attitude towards women that both oppresses them and also lifts them up. So it lifts them up because you're putting these women who take care of the household on a pedestal, and you're basically praising them for like, raising the children, which is like something that wasn't praised before. It was just expected of women, but now it's praised. But you're oppressing them because women that didn't do this were seen as like shameful, and it's very unwomanly you're basically not domesticated if you don't take care of your household, or if you're working in factories, which is going to be a little ironic considering when we go over the men's side. And lower class single women and wives needed to work sometimes though. And this is why. Men are considered the breadwinners of the household, but they don't nearly make enough. If you work in factories, you are not getting paid living wages, even for your really horrible apartment with like 2 other families that don't fit. You're not making enough to live, to provide for your family. So sometimes women would have to work. And that goes against the cult of domesticity, basically. And here's a picture of the cult of domesticity. So like we can see, the house is like all nice and cleaned, and women were basically supposed to be the refuge for men after their hard day of work. And they're supposed to take the children, make sure they're educated and nice and proper and everything is peaceful so that the man can just relax when they get home. So, like I was saying earlier, the cities are absolutely disgusting. And here's a picture of the cities during the Industrial Revolution. There's people in the corner, there's people on the other side, there's cars. Also, during this point when the automobile was made, automobiles made and trolleys and trams came into business, there were no streetlights. You went whenever you wanted to go, and you can imagine this caused quite a bit of traffic and accidents and deaths. So streetlights are going to be implemented once they realize maybe we should tell people when to go instead of just letting them go whenever. And this is basically your everyday picture of a city during this time period. So we have the people who are going to work against like people who are taking transportation to work, and these huge buildings are so close to one another that it's a safety hazard, and not just in terms of health, but also because if there's a fire in the future, maybe at a factory or something, cough, cough, it can spread so easily from one building to the next. So this is what your everyday city is going to look like. Lots of people, super cramped, basically just one huge mess. And people who own factories are rich, like they are ridiculously rich. And this class divide is basically going to give rise to the bourgeoisie or bourgeoisie, however you guys like to say it, and the proletariat. And if you guys have gone over communism and Karl Marx, then you know the bourgeoisie are the people who own the factories and the means of production. And the proletariat are those poor factory workers who are getting sick and basically working themselves to death. Because did they get paid well during this time? No. Did they get good working hours? No. Good working conditions? No. So, they're basically exploited. And they're super replaceable, so it's not like they can complain either. So, just remember, cities super cramped, horrible to live in. So if cities are super cramped, but your factory is there, what are you going to do? You can't move out to the countryside because that's ridiculously far away. And sometimes you just need to make sure, sometimes you need to go into the city because of all the new technology that it has compared to the countryside. So what they did was build suburbs. And here is a picture of a suburb. And look how nicely spaced those buildings are. And look at all that grass and that like nature and those roads. And just, yeah, look how different they are in comparison. And even though this isn't, the suburbs are like from an aerial point of view, if you're on the ground, it would be so nice. It would be such a difference. There wouldn't be so many people, not that much of a mess. So suburbs are where the rich people of this time period live, the factory owners, all those people. This is where they lived. And suburbs are basically the middle ground between your cities and your countryside. Close enough to get to the city by car, thank God for cars, right? And close enough to the countryside if you ever need to get away from the city and not breathe in all that disgusting pollution that you're creating. So now that we've gone over the first industrial revolution and the second, in the second industrial revolution, there is the rise of mass society. And mass society is basically things in society that used to be very exclusive are basically expanded so that they can reach everyone. And the four aspects of mass society are mass advertisement, mass production, mass politics, and mass leisure. So the first one we're going to start with is mass advertisement. And before, in pre-industrial revolution, advertisements went by word of mouth and newspapers. So if you didn't read the newspaper, so if you couldn't read or you didn't really talk to people, producers couldn't really get their products out. But with the rise of the radio and, the rise of radio, advertisement boomed. And there was no ad block back then. So radios and newspapers allowed for ads to reach massive amounts of people. Radio was the entertainment of the time at home. So if you had a radio, you could hear advertisements. And mass advertisement is also going to lead to consumerism, which we've seen before in past trends, like the commercial revolution. But it's going to lead to greater consumerism and even a certain amount of materialism, which is when you base your worth on how many items you have, or like the quality and what expensiveness of your items. So consumerism isn't technically bad, isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's very neutral, but materialism is when consumerism goes too far. So make that distinction if you guys are ever writing about, society and culture. And the second mass is mass production. So basically, with the rise of the automobile, Henry Ford created the moving assembly line, where everyone was basically assigned to a part, and as the product went down the assembly line, people would add their parts, and it hastened production so quickly and kept up with demand, especially for automobiles. So mass production is basically going to make sure that more of the products that everyone is buying, that the products that everyone are buying are still intact and are still in supply, so that producers can make more money and consumers can have more of what they want. The third mass is mass politics, and politics used to be very exclusive for like the upper middle class, those people, but political parties started emerging around this time period to advocate for factory workers and common people. And there would be trade unions who would, factory workers would join trade unions to get better working conditions and better hours and better pay. And they'd vote for people who made their lives easier or better. And the last mass is mass leisure. And mass leisure is basically workers who need a break could head to amusement parks and movies, or even listen to the radio for leisure due to the car. And the car simplified so many things for people. They basically got really quick transport. They could head to really far places on the weekend and make it back just in time to go to work. And, traveling didn't seem so hard anymore. So it allowed for a lot of migration into different, different cities, basically. So now I'm going to talk about government involvement. And if you can see this picture, based on this picture, I know it might be kind of vague or not clear, but can you guys tell me if you think the government was very involved in the Industrial Revolution or not very involved at all, based off what we've learned so far and this picture? So if you guys think that the government wasn't very involved, you'd be right at first. So this picture is just basically a bunch of factories spreading pollution into the air and all that good stuff. And at first, the government was partially involved, but only for monetary reasons. So they would subsidize inventors, like I said earlier, to make better inventions, or they would subsidize factories to produce what they wanted. But the government liked industrialization because of how much more money they were making. So they weren't going to tell factories to cut down on pollution, because then that would just divert their resources and money into something other than making more money. So in industrialized countries, like even today, China, there's really bad pollution because they are currently industrializing a lot. But in England, back then in the 1840s and the early 1800s, pollution was horrible. People got sick a lot from toxic waste, and the air was very unhealthy, practically black sometimes. And even inside factories, the conditions, it was dark, very dusty, wasn't a lot of fresh air you could breathe. So that was very bad for the people. So at first, the government was only involved for economic reasons, but as time went on, into the second industrial revolution, they're going to realize that the people want change and they can't keep ignoring it. So reform movements are going to be headed by private individuals, and then the government is going to start being involved. But the only thing that the government really did for the people, like from the beginning, was subsidized railroads and like new modes of transportation. So the government was the one funding building railroad tracks, and they're the ones funding building highways. And that's a trend that we're still seeing today. So some effects of the Industrial Revolution are increased jobs, efficient production, the dehumanization of labor, and overcrowded cities. So increased jobs might seem a little weird, but people lost their jobs, but the amount of jobs that became available far outweighed those that were lost. So like I said earlier, most farmers and handmade item makers lost their jobs due to machines, which would cause the rise of Luddites. And because they lost their jobs and didn't have a way to make money, they had to move to cities and resort to factory work. So like shoemakers, what once took them, like, even though making shoes are a very skilled job, machines could make shoes in like a third of the time they took and make them for much, much faster and much cheaper. And this quickness is going to lead to the dehumanization of labor, which I'm going to get into in a second. But it's important to note that not all people who were handmade item work, like used their hands, lost their jobs. So blacksmiths, machines can't copy that, so they kept their jobs. Plumbers, machines can't do plumbing for you, so they kept their jobs. Electricians would keep their job in the second industrial revolution. Those type of people would keep their jobs. The farmers and manufacturers of clothing items and other common items would lose their jobs. The Industrial Revolution also led to much more efficient production. So it takes you half the effort, but you make double the amount, which seems like a pretty good return. And like I said, machines could do in a few minutes what hundreds of men did in hours, which lowered the prices significantly and basically showed public approval of the Industrial Revolution because they were buying items for cheaper at the same quality. But all these machines basically dehumanized the workers who were working these machines. So people became dispensable, and they suffered bad working conditions, hours, and wages. 10 hours, they would work more than 10 hours a day for maybe some days like a penny a day. And we have to count for inflation, so a penny a day. And like I said, the room would be dark. They'd be moving like one part of their arm all day, checking up on machines, taking things out of a place and putting them into a machine, like cotton, and putting it into a machine to be woven, and then repeating that for hours with like maybe 1 30-minute break a day. So if people became ill, there was no like sick leave. They just had to come to work sick. And basically their lives, they'd work themselves to death basically, and they were replaceable because of how many people were available to work due to losing their jobs in the countryside. And lastly, we have the overcrowded cities, which we went over earlier, but we have disease, overcrowding, crime, like lots of crime, fires, all that good stuff. So in response to this agricultural revolution, well, not agriculture, in this response to this industrial revolution, we're going to see the rise of a movement. And can you guys guess what the movement is based off these two pictures? So if you guessed that the word begins with R and ends in an ism, you'd be right. And this movement is Romanticism. So Romanticism, it'll probably be on your AP Euro test, and I went over it 2 weeks ago, but Romanticism is basically an idealization of nature and nationalism. So you're going to see lots of beautiful landscapes and people basically facing nature or being like incorporated with nature. Those are key tenets of Romanticism, and they basically arose because of the Industrial Revolution. So definitely practice analyzing and identifying romantic works, because maybe you'll get a question on what art style this artwork is, and maybe it's Romanticism. So some reactions and the reforms that occurred due to the Industrial Revolution are this wonderful list right here. And like I said earlier, reform was usually pushed by private citizens. So citizens would start reforms first, and then after seeing how effective they were or how popular they were, the government would then follow afterwards. So, the popularity of private reform, and private reformers can't do everything. They need government support. So when the government finally gets involved, then we're going to see reforms have a much greater effect. So in the cities, we're going to have the first sanitation crew, that's started by Edwin Chadwick, and he sees like the amounts of human excrement on the streets, and like human waste, excrement, human waste, like rats, fleas, all that stuff. And he's going to work on cleaning the cities so that there's less disease and it's better for everyone. And cities, even though they are very overcrowded and they're very close, the buildings are very, very close together. So because of this, cities are going to start to be redesigned, and they're going to start to include parks. So, maybe on your way to work one day, you'll see this wonderful grassy area. And they do that to basically not have the workers feel so closed in and actually have experience a bit of nature. And cities are also going to get public transportation, railroads, buses. Not everyone can have a car. Public transportation so that those workers can get to work more efficiently. And they're going to have public lighting. So at nighttime, the streets are going to be much more busy. People don't rely on the sunlight or candles anymore. And this public lighting is basically going to revolutionize life, like I said. But it's also going to affect working hours, because now people can work into the night. And all of this basically falls under urban redevelopment. So governments are going to change the way cities are laid out so that there's less risk of a fire or disease spreading or crime. And police are actually going to start to be implemented. So The Industrial Revolution is when policing became like an actual occupation because of all the crime. So they're going to have police enforce rules and laws and make sure that, no one is breaking any rules. And so, like I said earlier, working conditions were really bad. They'd work more than 10 hours a day, maybe from like dawn to night, and then go home, sleep 6 hours, and then come back. And they'd work in awful conditions, like workers got no compensation for getting injured. If you got injured, lost an arm, mortally wounded, no compensation for you or your family, and no responsibility on the business. Lives are replaceable. Why did they care? So, and child labor. Child labor was rampant. So men worked, children worked, poor children worked, and women worked if they were single or if the family needed more money. So the 10 Hours Act is going to basically limit workdays to 10 hours, and the Factory Act is going to limit child labor. And over the years, more acts will come out to make work safer for people so that they don't lose limbs with those dangerous machines and don't get mortally wounded and, develop horrible diseases because they breathe in toxic air. And this all comes about because of trade unions that are formed by private citizens that eventually expand into politics. And one prime example of horrible working conditions is the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. So these young women were working, and one day a fire breaks out. And nowadays a fire would be scary, but there are protocols to make sure that all workers get out of the building safely. Not back then. Back then, to make sure that no one went on an unnecessary break, employers would lock the doors and windows. So what do you think happens when a fire breaks out and they can't get out because the doors are locked and the windows are locked? And if the windows weren't unlocked, but they had no way to get down, some women jumped to their deaths. So this really woke up the world and made them think, maybe we do need protocols for how to manage businesses and how to manage our workers. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was full of young single women who moved to the city to basically get money. And the owners of the company were found guilty for for their horrible treatment of their workers. But it took a horrible tragedy to get people to realize that they had to reform how they treated workers. So yeah. And the factory was started all because of a cigarette, which led to no smoking signs. And like I said earlier, Romanticism is a reaction to industrialization, because in the city, people couldn't see beautiful landscapes anymore and all that wonderful nature. So Romanticists basically wanted to cause nostalgia in people and have them remember what it felt like when they all lived in the countryside and breathed fresh air and were like in the middle of nature, because you don't really appreciate something until you lose it. And also industrialization, like I said earlier, caused people to become not people, I guess, like their lives weren't valued anymore, because pre-industrial revolution, if you went to work on a farm, your boss probably knew you, your family, you probably had dinner with your boss before, you were like friends or maybe good acquaintances. Here, there's so many workers that they probably don't know your name, your age, they don't really care about you. And Romanticism is going to be extremely popular with the people. And like in factories, people lost their individualism, so Romanticism also tries to get that back. And the last reaction is going to be the rise of mass politics. And like I said earlier, mass politics sought to represent the common worker. So some trade unions, while they were engaged in politics, not all of them were. Most of them just organized strikes and other things. But mass politics got was really spurred on by public education. So once child labor was limited, people realized maybe we have to care for like the children who are going to work because once there's a very high correlation between being poor and staying poor back then. So they decided that public education should be mandatory for all children up to like a certain grade point, of course, until later reforms. But public education basically makes people literate. And because they're literate, they can get more involved in politics because they understand what's happening and they're like informed voters. So mass politics, these huge political parties like for workers, you know, basically spurred reforms and increased wages for workers. They got better working conditions, like combined with trade unions, better wages, better working conditions, better hours. Yeah. So that's the Industrial Revolution. And realism was also a reaction to industrialization, but it was more of a reaction to Romanticism because realists wanted to portray the reality of the life that they were living, and that meant like darker colors. But Romanticists loved having that. Romanticists basically loved, what's the word I'm looking for? Romanticists loved nature and wanting to go back to those times, and realists thought that was horrible. Like, why are they embellishing life? Why don't they just portray it as it is? And the Industrial Revolution, so, realism is also a response, but also know that it's more of a response to Romanticism. And the Industrial Revolution is a really important topic because it appeared on the test, on the multiple choice I took last year. So I took the test last year and it appeared on multiple choice. And it also appeared on the free response questions, SAQ and LEQ if you chose a specific prompt. So I wrote about the Industrial Revolution for my LEQ and it was the optional SAQ, so I answered that for the SAQ, and it was a lot of easy points because it asked about what caused Great Britain's industrialization. And to mention, so I mentioned, and to add on, I mentioned that the Industrial Revolution ends in 1914 because of World War I. And the Second Industrial Revolution is going to be so important in leading to World War I because Germany becomes industrialized. So this was also an SAQ question 2 years ago in 2018. And industrialization, Germany is going to become the second most industrialized country in the world, and they're going to build up a huge standing army with like very impressive ships. I believe one of them was called the Dreadnought. And England, being the greatest navy in the world, is going to want to compete. So these countries are just going to keep building ships and more ships and more ships and more ships until it all comes to like it explodes. The tension explodes. And because industrialization, they can make these ships very easily. So remember, Industrial Revolution is a very important topic. Probably going to come up on your test this year, you guys. But it's generally easy. And thank you guys so much for tuning into my stream. I really hope I helped. And if you have any questions, leave them down below and I can answer them. So like if you guys have any questions, let me know. Like type them in the chat right now and I can answer them before we end it. Okay, so if you guys don't have any questions, thank you again. Thank you so much for coming to my stream. I hope that I helped clarify some things about the Industrial Revolution if you've already learned it, or I hope that you learned it a lot about the Industrial Revolution if you guys haven't, so maybe you can be ahead of the class and ace your next AP Euro test. And I hope you guys ace the exam in May. Make sure to tune in to Fiveable and follow for all your other AP classes, and follow our social media accounts. And I will be back to teach World War One. So this is a good segue into that a few weeks later. And our next stream is the rise of socialism, which is going to be a response to the Industrial Revolution as well. So again, thank you guys for coming, and I really hope I helped. Okay.